Before America, before the colonies. Even before the first kings of Europe, there was a path. This path wasn't carved by people. But by giant beasts on a scale that's hard to even imagine today. For thousands of years, this ancient route was followed by the first hunters. It became an artery for forgotten empires, and it witnessed the conflicts that would define a continent. And the wildest part, that same path is still here. Hidden right under our feet, holding the secret to how this nation was truly shaped. To really get this, we have to go way back, not just a few hundred years, but deep into geological time, to a world that would look almost alien to us now. The world of the last ice age. Over millions of years, the slow, relentless power of erosion carved a gift into the earth. The Cumberland Gap, a natural doorway through the Appalachian Mountains. As glaciers advanced and retreated across North America, they stopped around the Ohio River. This left Kentucky and the lands to the south as a huge, open expanse. It wasn't the thick forest we picture today, but a mix of grasslands and open woods. A perfect habitat for some of the largest land animals to ever exist. This was the age of the megafauna. Herds of colossal mammoths and mastodons migrated through these valleys. Giant ground sloths, bigger than grizzly bears, lumbered through the woods. And longhorned bison moved in vast, thundering herds. These creatures were all driven by the timeless search for food, water, and, crucially, salt. So, they naturally followed the paths of least resistance, sticking to high. Dry ridges to avoid the swampy lowlands. They moved from one essential salt lick to the next. Their immense weight and countless hooves pounded the earth, compacting the soil and clearing the way. Over thousands of years, these giants unintentionally engineered a network of trails. They carved a corridor through the wilderness, a path that was efficient, logical, and built to last. The world of the megafauna was one of immense scale. Their trails were arteries of survival. But they weren't the only ones who understood the logic of the land. Soon, a new force would arrive, one that would follow in the footsteps of the giants, and begin writing the first chapter of a human story that stretches right up to the modern day. So, who were the first people to discover this ancient highway? Around 12,000 years ago, as the Ice Age began to fade, the first humans entered this landscape. We call them Paleo-Indians, hunter-gatherers, who likely followed the great herds, their survival tied directly to the animals that had shaped the world around them. For these people, the megafauna trails were a gift. They weren't just a way to get around. They were a roadmap to life itself. Following the trail meant following the hunt. Imagine being one of these early people. Your entire world is the rhythm of the seasons and the movement of animals. You're armed with a stone-tipped spear, Your senses are sharp, and your knowledge of the land is everything. The path stretching before you, already cleared and flattened by mastodons, is your guide. It leads you to the herds, to the salt lakes, where animals gather, and to natural shelters in the mountains. In places like Carter Caves in Kentucky, people found refuge for thousands of years. Archaeological sites like Cloud Splitter and Courthouse Rock reveal millennia of human life. Hearths where families gathered and the tools of daily life they left behind.
The stew smells wonderful tonight.
These weren't just temporary camps, they were homes, returned to again and again. Over countless generations, all connected by this network of ancient paths. Carter County was also rich in a type of flint called shirt, a vital material for making stone tools. Artifacts made from this specific chert have been found across a vast region. Early proof that this path was already part of a much larger network. As the climate warmed and the great beasts vanished, the forests began to close in. The descendants of the first hunters adapted. The path, however, remained. It was just too useful, too deeply etched into the land to be forgotten. Its purpose just started to shift. It was no longer only a hunting trail. It was becoming a route for communication, for connection, and for the exchange of ideas. Different cultures rose and fell, but the path endured. By about 1000 BCE, new societies began to emerge. Cultures that would transform this simple animal trail into something far more complex. But this path was more than just a hunting ground. How did a simple animal trail become the lifeblood of entire cultures? What began as a path of survival slowly grew into a great artery of commerce. This route, a key part of a larger network, functioned as what we might call a common path, a neutral ground for exchange and travel. This was the highway of an ancient, interconnected world. Along this corridor, new, vibrant cultures flourished. The Adena and Hopewell peoples, famous for the magnificent mounds they built, established ceremonial centers and towns all along these routes. And they were anything but isolated. The paths connected them in a vast network of trade that crisscrossed the continent. At archaeological sites in Kentucky, researchers have found objects that tell a breathtaking story of connection. They've unearthed copper tools and ornaments mined near the Great Lakes. Hundreds of miles to the north. They've found obsidian, a volcanic glass used for razor-sharp blades, that was quarried in the Rocky Mountains, over 1,000 miles away. They've discovered shimmering mica from the Carolinas. And ornate jewelry made from conch shells. It started their journey on the Gulf of Mexico. These weren't just objects, they were the physical proof of a complex social and economic system. The path carried raw materials, finished goods, and most importantly, ideas. It was how traditions were shared, technologies spread, and alliances were maintained. The path was alive with people. Traders carrying precious flint. Diplomats on missions of peace. Pilgrims traveling to sacred sites. All following the same routes their ancestors had learned from the beasts. For indigenous nations like the Shawnee to the north and the Cherokee to the south, the path was the primary route into the rich hunting grounds of Kentucky. It led to major settlements like Escapakithaki, known today as Indian Old Fields, which was an important Shawnee town and a hub for trade in the 1700s. Further north, at the confluence of the Scioto and Ohio rivers, was Lower Shawneetown, a bustling center where native and European traders met. This path wasn't a single line on a map. It was a braided network of trails, following ridges from one watershed to the next. For thousands of years, this network was the circulatory system of a continent, a testament to a world far more interconnected than most of us were ever taught. If you enjoy these deep dives into forgotten history, consider subscribing. But wherever people, resources, and territories come together, trade can often turn to conflict. The very path that connected cultures also became a route for warriors. What turned this ancient route into what became known as the warrior's path? A name sometimes attributed to the Shawnee, Ethiamio. While it made trade possible, it was also a strategic military corridor. The Shawnee and the Cherokee were rivals who frequently clashed along the trail, vying for control of the Kentucky hunting grounds. War parties used the path's efficiency to launch swift raids and retreat just as quickly. This conflict exploded with the arrival of Europeans. The trail that had served indigenous peoples for millennia was about to play a new role, a vector for invasion. In the mid-1700s, colonists started hearing rumors of Kentucky, a paradise of unbelievable fertility and game, just beyond the mountains. The man whose name would become tied to this push west was Daniel Boone. But Boone didn't blaze a new trail. He followed the one that had existed for generations. Guided by indigenous knowledge, he widened this warrior's path through the Cumberland Gap. What was a highway for indigenous nations became, for the colonists, the wilderness road. This, of course, was an invasion. Settlers weren't coming to trade. They were coming to claim. The simmering conflict now erupted into a brutal war for the continent itself. For decades, the trail was a scene of relentless violence. Ultimately, the sheer number of settlers, backed by the power of the United States, proved overwhelming. Through treaties and forced removal, indigenous nations were largely displaced. New industries rose along the old route. Salt works were established at the same licks. During the Civil War, the Cumberland Gap was called the Gibraltar of America. A strategic choke point fought over by both armies. Finally, in the modern era, railroads and highways were laid down. Often following the same logical contours of the land. The path that once carried moccasins and hooves now carried coal trucks and cars. The great warrior's path seemed to have vanished, buried under the concrete. It seemed forgotten, but it was only sleeping. Today, the megafauna are gone. You might think the trail has vanished with them. But what if I told you that you've probably driven on parts of it? The warrior's path was never erased. It was repurposed. Its logic, the path of least resistance, is as sound for a Ford F-150 as it was for a Mastodon. When you drive on modern highways, you are tracing the same corridors. And today, a new chapter in the path's long story is being written. Historians and community leaders are working to bring the warrior's path back to light. This isn't just about putting up historical markers. It's a movement of revitalization. A key goal is to honor the indigenous history and tell the whole story. The second goal is economic, marking the path for heritage tourism. And perhaps most powerfully, this revival is about healing. It's about indigenous lead efforts to restore land and relationships. On acres once scarred by strip mining, they are working to rewild the landscape. And even plan for the return of bison, a living act of healing. The warrior's path teaches us that nothing is ever truly lost. History isn't just in books. It's a living presence right under our feet. For 12,000 years, this path has been a corridor of survival, a foundation for a nation. Now, it has become a bridge, remembering where we've been.
Hit subscribe for more deep dives into the forgotten realities of history, tech, and luxury.